Chapter 37, Apprentice. I don't trust wizards. Every time I levy taxes on them, they try to get my political opponents to pull swords from stones. Attributed to Louis Merovins, 7th First Prince of Procer. She's going to betray us, I stated. I'd kept it to only my senior officers tonight, but the circle was still larger than I liked. Juniper was lounging in her seat, face grim as Aisha stood a step behind her with her hands behind her back. Nock and Hune occupied half the tent by themselves, the broad-shouldered orc looking like a child next to the hulking shape of my ogre commander. Pickler and Killian shared a bench, which I noted with amusement was high enough off the ground neither of their feet touched the ground. Probably built with orcs in mind. Hakram stood behind me as a mirror of Aisha for Juniper, though a named one. Apprentice had taken the seat next to me without a word, and barely seemed to be paying attention. The last person in the room was Ratface, who raised a sardonic eyebrow before speaking. Really, he drawled, because Eris always struck me as so trustworthy. There were a few smiles at that, though no laughs. The mood was serious, as was our problem. Most of you already know our mandate, I said. The 15th, now bolstered with reinforcements from Callowan recruitment camps and a fresh set of auxiliaries, has been assigned to take the city of Lys. The head of the snake, Nock gravelled with a pleased note to his stone. The heart maybe, Aisha disagreed. The head is Countess Marchford and she's with the rebel host. Off subject, Hune said. There has been warning of betrayal and immediate danger, more important than semantics. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mazigo visibly restrain himself from responding to that. I hurried on before the situation could devolve. Our auxiliary corps, which we may have to suppress before this is over, is made of a little above 1,000 Procern light infantry, all mercenaries hired through Mercantes, Juniper. The hellhound stirred in her seat, dark eyes sweeping across the room. Procern infantry can broadly be divided in 3 categories, she said. The first is peasant levies, which usually make up most of the Principate's armies. Little to no training, basic equipment. Vulnerable to shock tactics, which are usually how Procern win battles. The second is Principality troops, cataphracts like the ones fielded by the Silver Spears and what would qualify as heavy infantry under our classification sheets. She leaned forward for the last part. The third is the type Eris has bought. In times of war inside the Principate, fields are burned and villages sacked. Men and women who no longer have a trade take up war as a full-time occupation, though without the benefit of princely funding for their arms. Leather and mail for armor, wooden shields and longswords for armament. Almost every single one of them will be carrying javelins, and they're more lethal a volley at close range than anything we carry. The hellhound let out a grunt. If you've been wondering why I covered the other 2 categories of soldiers, it's to give you comparison points when planning. We are not talking about better-armed peasants. These are soldiers who fought in the Procern Civil War and took on infantry that's in the same league as our heavies. They won't be used to sappers or field artillery, but they'll have fought mages before and some of the same tactics apply. Move fast and disperse, use terrain as cover when possible. They're faster than we are, and they'll avoid a collision of shield walls. There was a pause as everyone allowed that to sink in. Nock was frowning. Hune looked like she'd learned nothing new, and Apprentice might as well have been napping for how aware he'd been of what was going on. I cast a look at Ratface, and he cleared his throat. I've been given access to all the records kept by Eris in my function as quartermaster, he announced. I imagine some of them are falsified, and she's already tried to bury me in irrelevant documents, but some things can't be hidden. They won't have enough javelins for more than 3 volleys, I'm almost certain of that, and before our advance to Lys is over they'll be relying on us for food and water. Their forced march to Marchford burned through most of their supplies, and they lost some before when they got whipped by the lone swordsman. News of that defeat, when it had finally trickled to the 15th, had evoked mixed feeling in me. Eris getting so spectacularly beaten, even if she hadn't been there at the time, was a win in my book. She, had 4,000 men when she'd started the night, then lost half to defection and half again to a fighting retreat. On the other hand, William had picked up 2,000 former Stygian spear slaves to add to an army that was apparently already larger than mine. The Stygian magisters were a disgusting piece of work. There was no denying that, but their horrifying training methods had also produced some of the finest Calornian infantry since the early days of the continent. The phalanx was going to stop cold, whatever part of my own army faced it, and then start shredding it. I had a few counters to that, thankfully, but from now on I'd have to start planning around their existence on the other side of the field. Our current assessment is that the forces in Lys won't be meeting us on the field. Hakram spoke up from behind me, getting the meeting back on track. We've prepared for the eventuality of a siege. I looked at Pickler, and the serious-faced goblin jumped in. The reinforcements we picked up brought a pair of Fonte model trebuchets, as well as a standard load of goblin munitions. My sappers managed to make another 2 ballistae before we left Marchford, bringing our total to 3. We can bring down the city's walls if we take the time to do it properly. Hune cleared her throat, the sound like caged thunder. Are all of the ballistae irregular? My senior sapper looked displeased at the question, but she deigned to answer anyway. We've got 2 larger ones designed to clear the top of the enemy walls, as well as the one we fielded against the devils, which is fit for use as field artillery. The ogre commander grunted. That's a yes then. I'm not entirely comfortable with using untested designs on the field. I raised a hand to quiet down the brewing argument before it could properly develop. Hune was a stickler for regulations, and Pickler took questioning of her abilities in machinery building very personally. It was honestly surprising they'd never butted heads until now, at least never in front of me. We'll be running tests as soon as feasible, but it's my understanding of the situation that Senior Sapper Pickler's plans are derived from blueprints in use by the legions, I said, and no one thought it a good idea to argue. I disliked intervening too directly in the dynamics between the member of my high command, but now wasn't the time for anyone to get hurt feelings. Internal dissensions were close to the top of the list of things I couldn't allow to pass. I doubted anyone here was eager to defect to Eris after she'd unleashed a demon on us, but we'd not found all the leaks yet. Hakram had identified 2 small fries with unexplained scrying equipment, and I'd had them quietly executed before we left Marchford, but the kind of information Eris kept getting her hands on had to be coming from someone higher up in the 15th's food chain. Or at least someone who had access to someone cleared to know that kind of information. She's going to betray us, I reiterated, and we need to be ready for it. When it comes to troops, we have them outclassed in every way, but there's another aspect to this fight. Killian. My lover offered me a discreet smile before she started speaking, prompting a swell of guilt in me. I hadn't had much time for her lately, and the grace with which she'd taken that only made it worse in my eyes. We've been coordinating with Lord Apprentice to set up a few surprises for the enemy, the redhead announced. Mazigo seemed to wake finally. The current suspicion is that Eris has possession of a standard which holds the binding of a relatively minor demon from the 13th hell, the bespectacled man spoke, still slumped in his seat. I've retooled a ritual that will allow us to forbid its manifestation, essentially keeping it stuck inside the standard. Unfortunately, the ritual requires very precise timing, Killian explained when it became clear he wouldn't keep talking, and at least 40 mages acting in concert under the supervision of Lord Apprentice. If there'd been a table in this tent, instead of just a handful of seats and benches, I would have drummed my fingers on the surface of it. Eris can't be allowed to play that card, I stated. Not a second time, not if we're to win. I'm creating a temporary task force whose sole purpose is preparing for that ritual. The involved personnel will be assigned by Senior Mage Killian, who will be forwarding you a list of names later tonight. There was no argument from the gallery, even at the loss of mages. The memory of the rampaging demon and the round of executions that had followed its appearance was still fresh for everyone. I'm worried we're focusing too much on Eris, boss, Nock graveled. She's dangerous, but all she's got is 1,000 mercs and some nasty mage tricks. In Lys, there's at least 7,000 soldiers and a bunch of heroes waiting for us. They've got walls, they've got numbers, and they've got access to a lake. Starving them out isn't an option. We'll have to punch through. We've got ideas for Lys, the Hellhound intervened. At the moment, we're focusing on Eris because those ideas require time and lack of intervention on her part. Are we allowed to know what those ideas are? Ratface asked dryly. I didn't want to risk the plans, Juniper, and I had hatched getting out before they were implemented, but I could at least point my officers in the general direction. We've got a massive imbalance in our favor on the magical side, I told Ratface. We intend to leverage that. Fortifications in all major Calawan cities have wards woven in, Apprentice contributed. But they're not unbreakable, and if the other side doesn't use mages to counter us, we'll have free reign. As for the lone swordsman, I said, he'll be mine to handle. The thief and the bard have limited combat value, though when we get closer to Lys, we'll have another briefing to address them. With everyone up to date on the latest developments, it was about time to wrap this up. Any other questions? I prompted. Pickler raised her head. Robber has been on assignment for over a fortnight now, she said. I looked at Juniper, who nodded. You can consider his cohort of sappers detached from other duties for the foreseeable future, I said. I've got work for them. Anything to do with the Prosrans who turned up dead this morning? Hune asked. We're keeping that operation under wraps, Juniper grunted. High Command must retain plausible deniability as much as possible. Given the specific orders I'd given the Tribune, that much was an understatement. We were breaking both Tower law and Legion regulations, and not in ways that got you a fine and a slap on the wrist. No one else had anything to bring up, so my officers scattered shortly afterwards. Hakrem made to linger, but I shook my head. Apprentice remained in the seat opposite of mine, slouched with his eyes closed. He'd been sleeping almost 10 hours a day lately, often catching naps in supply wagons when the rest of us were marching. I waited until we were alone in the tent before speaking again. Mazigo, I spoke up. Dark eyes blinked open, staring at me through enchanted spectacles. Catherine, he replied, fingers rubbing at his left wrist where the demon's blood had touched his skin and now burned flesh remained. I expect you're about to spit out whatever you've been almost saying to me for the last fortnight. He'd noticed that, had he? At first I'd kept my distance to see if he was acting strangely. Whether or not, his judgment seemed to have been affected by an outside source. The problem was, I didn't know Mazigo that well. I'd shared drinks with him, spoken alone quite often, but I didn't have the kind of friendship with him I had with Adjutant. Would I even notice if he was acting strange? Warlock had cleared him of corruption, but I remembered that the man had paused before doing so. It could have been how the spell took to cast, or something else entirely. I'd nearly brought up the concern to Black, but I already knew what his answer would be. He'd trust Warlock's word. Scribe had told me once that Black's great flaw as a villain was personal loyalty. Warlock was his first and oldest friend. The conclusion there wrote itself. Whatever precautions I took would have to be my own. I'm sorry, I said, and I was, though not for the reasons he'd think. He looked baffled. Whatever for? I tapped my own left wrist and he flinched. I took you into a fight with a demon, ill-prepared and knowing the kind of consequences it could have. Mazigo sighed, the trinkets in his dreadlocks tinkling gently as he shook his head. Is that really what you've been chewing on all this time? I would have gone with or without you, Catherine. I kept my surprise off my face as well as I could. You never struck me as the kind of man who took stands to defend strangers, I said cautiously. I did not mean to give offense, though I did believe what I just said. Mazigo didn't really care about people in a broader sense. A few individuals he liked, perhaps, but even then sacrifice was not in the cards for Apprentice. It just wasn't the way he thought. The dark-skinned man snorted. Thank the gods I'm not, he said. Look at all the trouble that keeps getting you into. No, this wasn't about the people. It was about the demon. I raised an eyebrow. Is this a Warlock thing? You think you have a duty to keep demons contained. That could be useful, though it would be coming out of nowhere. I'd never gotten the impression that diabolism and demonology were anything but passing interests of his. He'd known ways to handle the demon, sure, but it hadn't felt like a personal specialty. I don't owe anyone a damned thing, Mazigo said, displaying white teeth in a hard smile. The demon itself was besides the point. It was the effect their kind has on creation that was worth witnessing firsthand. You went into battle against a monster like that for a scholarly pursuit, I repeated disbelievingly. His face turned from amused to serious in a heartbeat. It may be that to you, he conceded. It isn't to me. Then help me understand, I asked, because this makes no sense to me. A pudgy hand pushed back an errant braid, ignoring the silver mirror shard woven into it. I don't remember my life from before my fathers adopted me, he admitted. My first memories are of playing in a sprawling garden under a warm sun, tripping in a pile of daffodils. I didn't interrupt, though the image had my lips twitching in amusement. I grew up there in that garden, sleeping outside more often than inside the tower where Father ran his experiments. Dada used to bury me in blankets and tell me stories until the moon came out. Never once did it become winter. Weather control. That was an almost absurdly costly branch of sorcery, and rarely behaved as it was supposed to. Besides, I'd have heard of it if some part of the empire had resisted the passing of seasons for several years in a row. It was the kind of thing that drew attention. Mazigo smiled at the curiosity on my face. It was a spell of a sort. When I turned 9 years old, Father decided I was old enough for us to return to Ader, so he unmoored the chunk of land he'd stolen from Arcadia and allowed it to crumble. My eyes widened. You weren't in creation. Between it and Arcadia, he replied. Did you know the full name for that place is Arcadia Resplendent? There's a reason for that. Beautiful doesn't even begin to cover it. He laughed, but there was no joy in it. 9 years old and I saw the world end, he said. I don't think Father realized what he was teaching me. Creation is aptly named, Catherine. It was created by the gods above and below, to settle some kind of moral pissing match, apparently, but I've no interest in that. He raised his palm up and whispered a word in the mage tongue. A globe of light appeared over his hand, small sprites of energy spinning inside of it. All we are is a spell, and spells. He closed his hand over the globe and it winked out, can be dismissed, at any time for any reason. All that's required is will. There's more to it than that, I said. Is there? He smiled. I'd like to believe so. Am I just an insect on a speck of cosmic mud, or does my immortal soul make me something greater? That is the question that has been hounding me all my life. So you watch the places where creation comes apart, I spoke slowly, to understand what makes it tick. Mazigo's eyes behind his spectacles were smoldering with real passion, for the first time since I'd met him. There is a law in sorcery called the sapience limit, he told me. A mage cannot create something of a higher order of sentience than themselves. For millennia, sorcerers and wizards alike have tried to discover whether it is a creational law or an original one, without success. An original law applies to the gods themselves, Catherine. Consider the implications of that. I was starting to think I needed to pay more attention to Killian when she talked magic after we got done with the fun parts. You're saying that the only difference between us and the gods is power, I said. He shook his head. Power is a consequence, a happenstance enforced by laws that were artificially set in place. Knowledge is the heart of this, and should a man know as much as a god? He shrugged. Would there even be a difference? I took a long moment to process that, silence heavy in the tent. Weeping heavens, and I'd thought my teacher was ambitious. This is more than a little blasphemous, I finally said. Fuck the gods, he said calmly. Every single one of them. I can respect what you and Uncle Amadeus are trying to accomplish, I really can, but you're looking at the other prisoners when you should be looking at the bars. I need a drink, I thought. The philosophy he'd just described could have been taken straight out of one of those old preachy fairy tales I had a book full of. The madman with great power trying to grasp something beyond his understanding, wrecking the world in his hubris. Fuck. I'd gone into this conversation hoping my contingency wouldn't be needed, but now I couldn't pretend it wasn't even a little bit. Had he been like this before the demon? I couldn't know. I cursed myself again for not having taken the time to get no Mazigo better after summer home. I'll stay with you until the end of the rebellion, Apprentice assured me, misinterpreting my silence. I made a commitment, and seeing heroes in action again might yield some additional understandings. When the campaign is over, I'll return to Marchford to study the thinning there between creation and Arcadia. I cleared my throat. That's all I can ask of you, Mazigo, I said. You've already helped us much, and you'll be missed sorely when you leave. Flatterer, he replied, but he pushed up his spectacles to hide his embarrassed pleasure. I know you're not part of the 15th in any official fashion, I continued, but I've considered you one of us since summer home. The men agree, so I made you this. I fished out a small brooch from inside my doublet. Bone, roughly shaped as two snakes swallowing each other's tails around a circle, stamped with the 15th meson numbers. You made this? He asked in surprise. Can't carve for the life of me, I admitted, but I killed an oxen and raised it. I can kind of shape the bones when my power is in it. That explains the traces of your name in it, he smiled. Help me put it on. I rose easily and stood behind him, picking a braid on the back of his neck and carefully threading it inside the hair. I adjusted a last time and stepped back around, only to be greeted with a warm smile. Thank you, he said, touching my arm. It means more than you think. He excused himself afterwards, and I felt dirty as I watched him part the folds of the tent. There was just a bit of my power left in the brooch, just like he'd said. Enough to activate a small mechanism Robber had created inside before treating and filling the whole bone with goblin munitions. During the war games last year, I'd gotten to observe that the alchemy reacted violently to name power. If it was ever activated, it would blow his neck clean off. Contingencies, I murmured to myself. I went to look for a fucking drink. Conspiracy I. In its infancy, the 15th was in the awkward position of being within spitting distance of the heart of the Empire without being part of it. Legate Juniper, ever brutally sardonic, pointed out that given how tall their manners stood, they had a better chance of landing the spit on us than us on them. History wasted no time in proving her correct. Extract from the personal memoirs of Lady Aisha Bishara. Hakram had learned the move from the battle master for the Howling Wolves when he was 9 years old. Catch the enemy's wrist with your hand, leveraging greater muscles, and on the other side slap your open palm on the human's ear. The Wheateaters were known to be delicate in the head by the standards of the clans. There was a pop as the dark-skinned man's eardrums burst. The pain stopped him for a moment. The adjutant snarled, lunging forward and sinking his teeth in the exposed throat. Long fangs buried in soft flesh, ripping through veins and arteries as he shook his head out. The stranger twitched, blood spraying everywhere and coating Hakram's face with pleasant warmth, then dropped. Eyes perfectly calm, he looked for the other man who tried to accost them but found Aisha had already taken care of it. She'd buried a knife to hilt through the Soninke's eye. With measured elegance, she slid out the knife, flicking away some kind of transparent fluid. Robber popped out of the side alley a moment later, shaking his head. There were only two, the yellow-eyed tribune said, face unusually serious. It seemed even Robber took attempts to kill them seriously, on occasion. Swallowing the last of the meat, Hakram cleared his chops of the gore with a rough tongue. Good thing no other orc was around. It was considered a pretty suggestive movement where he was from. But then the Howling Wolves kept to many of the traditions from the lesser steppes, for all that they lived in the heart of the northern ones. An unbroken line of shamans and blood witches going back to the Golden Age had done much to keep the old ways alive. You were the target, Aisha decided, addressing him nonchalantly as she riffled through her corpse's clothes. "Mine spent half the fight trying to get at you." Hakram almost chuckled. Aisha might call that little rumble a fight, but what he'd seen of her part of it had looked more like a cold-blooded execution. The Hellhound's second had not hesitated so much as heartbeat before putting down her opponent, not that this surprised him. Tagreb were not a merciful people, and their nobility had only gotten where it was by being terrifyingly nastier than all other comers. Not even the orcs had ventured in the hungering sands, back in the days of their power. The only people to have mastered the desert tribes were the Mizans, and hadn't they mastered the whole world? "Can't blame them, my boy Hakram is a handsome bastard," Robber added thoughtfully. "More bastard than handsome, in truth, but he only has so much to work with." "Your moral support humbles me," the adjutant replied mildly, then returned his attention to the olive-skinned aristocrat. If they had a target, this wasn't two locals trying to shake up soldiers after payday. Aisha raised a condescending eyebrow at him. She'd yet to manage to shake herself of that habit, not that Juniper had done anything to help. The Hellhound apparently found the sight of humans sneering at other humans amusing. "This was an assassination attempt, Hakram," the aristocrat said. "There's no use trying to pretend otherwise." The tall orc had arrived at the same conclusion, actually, but he disliked hurrying to judgment. In a city like Ader, acting too quickly was a dangerous thing. The 15th was camped half a day away from the scheming heart of the Empire, and this was far from the first time they'd been probed by unknown forces. Had Lord Black not still been in the capital, he imagined it would have been much worse. The Empress' right hand cast a long shadow, and few were willing to risk the man's ire by attacking his pupil directly. Until today, it seemed. Hakram would not delude himself into thinking he'd achieved enough as an individual to rank an assassination attempt. It was his function in the 15th Legion that merited killing. "The boss is going to be in a mood when she hears about this," Robber said delightedly. Aisha frowned at the comment, then rose to her feet. "No personal effects," she said. "He does have a tattoo between his shoulder blades, though." The staff tribune had thoughtfully flipped the corpse over for them to look at. Hakram knelt by the dead human and peered at the inked skin. Some kind of bird picking at a corpse. He cast a look at Aisha, silently asking for information. "A buzzard, I think," she said. "Associated with Aksum in Saninke heraldry, but I've never seen this symbol before." That didn't mean much. The Dread Empire wasn't as bad as Callow or Procer, where everybody and their goat had a sigil, but the wasteland bred ancient conspiracies the way the West whelped chivalric orders, and every single one of them had some sort of meaningful secret sign. Tyrants stamped them out whenever they came in the open, but for everyone out in the sun, there were a dozen meeting in crypts. Ignoring Robber, never a good idea that Aisha met his eyes squarely. Unusual. Tagreb and Saninke both avoided doing that whenever they could. Demons and devils taking human shape could use eye contact to steal your soul, as could some warlocks. Aisha was being serious about whatever she would say next. "We can't tell Lady Squire," the staff tribune said. Robber burst out laughing. "Boy, did you pick the wrong crowd to try to float that." The Goblin Tribune wasn't wrong. Inside the unofficial Squire faction of the 15th, both he and Robber were prominent members. Nock was the only one more outspoken about his allegiances. The other orc had decided that Cat was the warlord of their generation, and as far as he was considered, that settled the matter. Every matter, really. Good orcs did not question their warlord, though they ripped out the guts of anyone who did. And yet, Hakram did not believe in unthinking service. Blind obedience had been the death of many a villain. Aisha Bishara was an aristocrat to the bone, but that did not make her the enemy. The 15th would come to telly on her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of tower politics in the coming years, he suspected. "Why?" he asked. Aisha straightened, her face smoothing out in a pleasant mask. The apparent charms of her appearance, that Ratface still couldn't shut up about when he got into his cups, were thankfully lost on Hakram. Humans were like ugly, hairy, two-legged cows. Unlike orcs, they got hair on every part of their bodies, instead of just the top of the head. Why the males got beards and mustaches when the females didn't was just one of those mysteries of biology. He suspected whatever gods had created humans had not been sober at the time. "You're her favorite, Hakram," Tribune Bishara stated. It was not a question, and he did not deny it. Exactly what Kat saw in him he wasn't sure, but he liked her enough he didn't care to question the bond. "If Lady Squire hears there was an attempt on your life, she'll be kicking down every door in Ader until she gets to hang whoever she deems responsible." "It'll be fun," Robert grinned. "Been millennia since there was a proper greenskin raid on the capital." "That's her whole point, Robert," Hakram understood as he remained silent. Even the goblin had unconsciously realized that Prissy soldiers would balk at entering the streets of Ader in full gear to exact retribution. The Calawan recruits were still an unknown quantity, but they might see the whole affair as a way to wiggle out of service to the legions. Too many risks involved. Her response could be more measured than that, he pointed out. People who underestimated Catherine Foundling had this nasty habit of eating dust. "It won't be," Aisha said confidently. "You didn't see her in the tower when one of Eris' minions provoked her. She broke that girl's finger without hesitating and then paid for it. The 15th's too young. We can't afford to make the kind of enemies a heavy-handed retaliation would earn us." "We're not without protection ourselves," the orc said. Aisha shook her head. "We can't get the Black Knight involved. Relying on his protection every time we have a problem just makes us a liability. We need to start dealing with these kind of messes ourselves, Hakram." Quickly, quietly, cleanly. She wasn't wrong, he decided. The orc was not sanguine at the idea of involving the most famous of the calamities in their business, in all honesty. Kat seemed strangely fond of the man, but Hakram considered him a considerable danger nonetheless. He wasn't willing to hide any of this from Squire, but neither was it necessary to send a runner to her the moment things got complicated. Taking care of issues like this fell under his function as adjutant, in fact, if not in name. He took a moment to consider the possible consequences, ignoring the way impatience flickered in Aisha's eyes, then made his final decision. "Agreed," he said. "Hakram," Robert broke in, looking startled. "You can't possibly." "We hang a dozen nobles and the entire court will be out for blood," the orc replied. "It might become enough of a mess we won't get deployed." Deployed where, he did not yet know. Kat was playing that one close to the chest, but she'd made no secret of how urgent getting the 15th in fighting shape was. That much was common knowledge among all the high-ranked officers of the Legion. "We still need a lead," Robert conceded grumpily. "I have a cousin who may know something," Aisha offered. "The same one who ran the sword and cup, if Hakram had to guess." Clever of the staff Tribune to turn a family-owned property into the unofficial watering hole of her legion, but Hakram misliked the idea of getting too many unknowns involved. "We're keeping this in-house. We already have a man if we need a guide in the underbelly of Ader," he said. Aisha grimaced and Robert cackled. "Let's go visit Ratface then," the goblin grinned. Hakram waited until they'd left the alley ahead of him to lean over the closest corpse and pluck out the eyeballs, popping one into his mouth. No use wasting good meat, and it looked like he wouldn't be getting dinner. Aisha knew where Hassan Ratface, as the others still called him, was. He'd already been a regular at the Burnished Swan when she'd first become involved with him, long before other cadets had taken to drinking. It had been part of what had made him attractive at the time, the way he seemed to have lived, strayed outside the confines of cadet routine and the war college. She should have known that no one took up frequenting dives like this unless there was already something wrong in their life, and the list of Hassan's issues would cover several small books. Their parting had been amicable, though apparently surprising to him, but having been the one to distance herself, she disliked the idea of asking for his help now. She'd let Hakram do the talking, if she could. Owing the other Tagreb a favor was not something she desired to happen anytime soon. Robber, the irritating pest, seemed to smell her discomfort. A romantic reunion, eh? He leered. Careful not to swoon too hard, the floors look dirty. Weakness is a goblin's meal, the saying went. Give this one an inch, and soon he'd be chewing your bones. I will have you drowned in a latrine pit, she replied in Tagribi, smiling invitingly at him. Hakram snorted. The goblin was, at least, correct about the floors. The burnished swan was in dire need of a mop, and a handful of stray dogs were digging at scraps the patrons occasionally threw them. The parlor was full of bang smoke, and the heavy smell of poppy pipes from the back where hard men and women gambled with dice and bones over narrow tables. She ignored the few leers she got from older men and headed straight for the stairs, taking the lead. There were a handful of private rooms there, and the one furthest back had been set aside for Hassan permanently. How exactly he'd managed that she was not sure, but she suspected that more than money had changed hands. She rapped her knuckles thrice against the door before pushing it open, Hakram and Robber trailing in behind. Much like the last time she'd been here, Hassan was seated on a pile of cushions with piles of parchment and a cheap set of scales at his side. 2 empty jugs of wine were to his left, and a full one was currently employed in pouring himself a cup. The supply tribune's handsome features twisted in surprise, an unseemly display of bare emotion. He must have been rather drunk. The other Tagreb despised everything their culture stood for, but he'd not left behind the concept of losing face even in private. Well, Hassan spoke up, the slur in his voice barely noticeable, this is a surprise. Oh gods, he's drunk, Robber said, sounding thrilled. Quick, Ratty, how many fingers am I holding up? Hassan replied to the goblin's flipping off in kind, his eyes passing over her and finally coming to rest on Hakram. I have a feeling I'm not going to enjoy the coming conversation, he said. We left 2 corpses in an alley, Robber contributed cheerfully. One of these days, Aisha was going to strangle him. No tonight, unfortunately, but the time would come. There was an assassination attempt on Hakram, the olive-skinned aristocrat said. We disposed of the assailants. Hassan rubbed the bridge of his nose, then carelessly gulped down his whole cup of wine. Fuck, he said. There goes my night off. Why are you 3 here instead of, say, in camp arming up? There was a tattoo on the back of the corpses, Hakram gravelled. A buzzard picking at a corpse. Marked men, it's not unusual, Hassan replied. I reiterate, why the hells are you 3 not in camp while a runner gets foundling? Aisha almost frowned. The familiar way he insisted on referring to Lady Squire was quite irritating. The greenskins could be excused the poor manners, but she knew the other Tagreb had been raised better than that. Even bastards got etiquette lessons, and Hassan had been presumptive heir to his father's lordship for the better part of a decade. We won't be getting Lady Squire involved, she said. Her former lover laughed. I could swear I just heard you say no one was going to tell Catherine Foundling an assassination attempt was made on her personal adjutant, he said. Clearly, I've been drinking too much. Could someone speak again, but use words that don't make me want to order a 4th jug of wine? Hakram cleared his throat, and Aisha cast the situation an interested look. Technically speaking, Hassan was of higher rank than the orc, so was she, as a tribune-ranked member of the general staff. The hierarchy at play was muddled by the fact that technically Hakram answered directly to the Lady Squire and was deepest in her confidence. The adjutant might yield little authority in theory, but at the moment he could end a career or string a noose with a single whisper. That he'd shown remarkable restraint in the use of his influence had cemented Aisha's respect for the orc, who she'd always considered one of the most competent members of Rat Company. Concerns have been raised that she may retaliate in a way that burns a lot of bridges, Hakram said. Robber mimed getting hanged to help getting the point across. Almost useful of him. Maybe she'd have him drowned in scum water instead. Hassan smiled thinly. I bet she will, the Supply Tribune agreed. She'll take fire and sword to the city until she owns the hide of whoever's responsible. He poured himself a glass, hand surprisingly steady. Perhaps not so drunk after all. Or just so used to drinking he's developed a talent for this, she thought less flatteringly. I don't see a problem with that, he finished, sipping at his wine. Ader could do with fewer fucking nobles. This whole empire could. She'd known it would come to that. Aisha felt her blood rise. For someone talented in so many clever ways, Hassan was so horribly dim in others. He couldn't see past his grudge against his father, and had extended that hatred to every aristocrat in Pries, which was punishingly narrow-minded if he wanted to pursue a career in the legions. 100 times she told him that he'd never be more than a career tribune if he was openly hostile to anyone with influence in the tower. Gods below, half the students at the War College were nobly born. Aisha smoothed out her temper, which had thankfully escaped anyone's notice. Reasoning would be of no use here. For all that, her quiver was not yet empty. Softening her face, she knelt next to the Supply Tribune. "Please, Hassan," she asked softly, lightly touching his bare wrist. "For me, just this once." His hard-eyed defiance deflated almost instantly. Her met her eyes with his for half a heartbeat, just long enough not to break custom, then looked away. Aisha almost felt guilty for exploiting the fact that he was quite obviously still in love with her when she did not feel the same, but guilt weighed little on the scales compared to the consequences of failure here. "Bish," he murmured, "don't be like that, I'm following protocol here." "I'm not asking you to follow the rules, I'm asking you to do what's best for the 15th, she replied just as quietly. And that was what tipped the vase over in his mind. Hassan loved the legions with an almost childlike purity. He'd found the family there that his blood had denied him, and all his allegiances were founded on that bedrock. He would do much for her, but even more for the 15th. "Fine," he finally grimaced. "I don't recognize the mark, but I know someone who will." He rose to his feet a little unsteadily, only to be settled by the touch of her hand on his chest. "Thank you," she said. "Don't do that," he muttered. "I know what you're doing, I'm just fool enough to fall for it anyway." He left them in the room, heading down the stairs. There was a moment of silence, then Robber whistled. "That was the coldest thing I've seen all day, and Hakram just ate a guy," the goblin said. "Part of one," the orc corrected mildly. Aisha glared at the wretch. He just slid back to latrine drowning. So Juniper's handmaiden had just worked the harshest of wiles on poor innocent Ratface, which boded ill for the guy's love life. Robber sympathized, inasmuch as he could sympathize with anything or anyone. It wouldn't stop him from mercilessly mocking the man later, but he liked to think of that as a labor of love. The quartermaster came back with the shadiest woman Robber had ever seen, and he was a goblin. Matrons basically became matrons by proving it was possible to be even more outrageously ruthless than their predecessors, and every single female goblin who was a matron was one poisoning away from correcting that injustice. This wonder of humanity glared suspiciously at all of them, then spoke in soft aside to Ratface in some horribly garbled Tagrabai dialect. "I trust them," the quartermaster said, with laudably poor judgment. "You've killed marked men," the woman said, then spat to the side. "What was the mark?" "A buzzard tearing into a corpse," Hakram said. The stranger looked at the adjutant like he was something a dog had thrown up on her carpet. "Ah, one of those." Ader wasn't as bad as some of the northern cities of the empire, but there were still quite a few people there who thought greenskins shouldn't be allowed to step foot out of their lands until they were called for. Apparently, Nock had lost his shit over something like that in Thalasina, yet another proof that the thick-headed bastard was unfit to be with Pickler in any way. "Catacomb children," the woman said. "Old gang from Aksum. Used to do contract killings for the True Bloods until Assassin had a talk with them." By which she likely meant that they'd all been found in a warehouse dead of a string of unlikely, yet simultaneous mortal accidents. Robber had always approved of the sense of humor the calamity was rumored to have. If you couldn't make murdering your enemies hilarious, what was even the point? Well, fun. And getting paid. But that wasn't the particular point he'd been referring to, so his argument still stood flawless and unbroken. And where do those naughty kids hole up, my blatantly criminal friend? Robber asked. Muzzle your pet, the woman told Ratface in Tagrabai. That man is Tribune Robber of the 15th Legion, Aisha replied sharply in the same. Watch your tongue if you intend to keep it. Ah, good old Aisha. Might despise him, but anybody insulting a legionary was in for a rough time if she was around. Almost endearing how easy it was to wind her up. The other woman spat again, but she didn't care to get into a pissing match with someone who might as well have Highborn stamped on her forehead. Decoram Quarter, she said, near the buried sewer entrance. Robber almost whistled again. Taking a contract on a legionary was proof those boys hadn't been great thinkers, but this was spectacular confirmation. Only raging imbeciles set up shop near Ader's sewers. The whole place was crawling with giant spiders. At least 500,000 by the last estimate, and they got bigger the deeper you went. They said dread Emperor Tenebris himself, well, herself now, was the one spawning them, having gone from thinking he was a giant spider in human skin to actually being one. Oh, those wacky humans. Second-year tactics class spent a whole fortnight going over the logistics of clearing out the sewer system and the tunnels running under it, an exercise to demonstrate the concept of a victory too costly for the results achieved. Mages sworn to the tower shed put wards over all the exits, but now and then one got out and nabbed some poor fool out in the streets at night. That these catacomb children had decided it was clever to base themselves close to a nigh-endless flood of death, only barely bottled up promised it would be good clean fun to take them on. 2 corpses fair, the criminal asked Ratface. In good shape too, where did you kill them, Aisha? The aristocrat looked like she was too good to frown, but kind of wanted to anyway. 2 streets east of the Sword and Cup, she replied. Hakram looked like he'd gotten caught hiding Arog under his bunk again. The eyes might be missing on one, he admitted. Oh, was that eye breath? Robber asked. Gods, you really have a problem with those. Nobody sells them fresh around here, the adjutant replied defensively. The sketchy woman, who'd been about to hand Ratface 7 denarii, took 2 back from the quartermaster's palm. She left without bothering with goodbyes, ignoring Robber's cheerful wave. Hassan, Aisha said, what does that woman trade in? Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, Ratface grunted, pocketing the silver. Robber rubbed his palms together. So this is the part where I talk to a few of my people, and we have a nice chat with these funeral adults. We all know you're getting that wrong on purpose, Hakram noted. Lies, the Goblin Tribune exclaimed. Calumny, possibly even a setup. He leaned closer to Aisha. You can never trust a greenskin Bishara, he confided. They're a shifty lot. The noble looked like she was about to say something scathing when Ratface broke in, because he was the enemy of all forms of joy and laughter. You can't bring a goblin raiding party in the city, Robber, he said. This is Ader, not Foramen. Everyone important in the city will know they're here within the hour and our targets disappear into the crowd. The Tribune scowled. He'd been looking forward to giving his boys and girls some exercise. There's currently 200 legionaries on leave in the city, Aisha said. Staff Tribune, coming to the rescue with her intimate knowledge of duty rosters. So we assemble a crew, then get out hands on some weapons, Robber grinned. And then we clean up this mess, Hakram said, baring his fangs.